Hello, everyone. Last week, we talked about, unassigned faults is really the way to begin in an area, especially when it's as complex as some of this deep stuff that we were looking at in here. And, I'm going to jump around, just depends, but as I think of things. So horizontal and vertical scales, it's critical to look at your seismic in the right way. And there are different times when you're going to be looking for different things. So this particular scale is fine for a quick regional overview and sometimes for quick picking. But I'm always going in here. In this case, under Kingdom, it's under Settings, Horizontal Scale, Vertical Scale. If you're in two-way time and you want to look in detail, if I want to do that, then I'll go to something like 10 inches per second. And in this case, if I'm going to look in detail, I'll change my horizontal scale. And I personally like to go with the true distance option here. Now, most people in processing are used to traces per inch. They're 40 traces per inch. I don't really like that because I like a true horizontal distance. You make your maps at a particular horizontal scale, such as 1 inch equals 1,000 feet, for example. Oops, 1,000. So my main point here is that over an interpretation exercise, as you work, first of all, from the regional to ultimately, say, intermediate to prospect scale, you're always changing the look and feel. I'll sometimes write a few key scales. After I do a first look, I'll decide that, okay, I'm going to write down 1 inch equals 1,000 feet horizontally, goes with 10 inches per second vertically. And that's, I would call this like an intermediate scale. So anyway, you'll constantly change the way you look at it. I forget if did we talk about the black and white palette last week versus the other palettes? Do you remember? For map, yeah. So one of the secrets of interpretation is, I'm going to say, it's all about the art of the color palette. So first of all, any particular workstation will have lots of color palettes. And over time, you will get to know those palettes and you will know which ones to use in certain circumstances. So we'll start here. This is one of the best known color palettes out there because this was really the first company that got into mapping of workstations. And that's, of course, Landmark, which is now DSG. So that's a very common palette. A lot of people like to see that palette. And by the way, depending on your eyesight, different palettes may work better or not as well for you. I like to say I can look at people's maps and tell them if they're colorblind. And it's true that depending on your color perception, you will see different things. So just never forget that the art of the color palette. So this is a very standard one. Now, when I'm actually doing my picking and I have lots of events, I do like the black and white for one very simple reason, which is almost any palette you use is going to clash with some of the colors that you're going to pick for your events. And so the nice thing is when you go to just a simple black and white, that every event you create, whatever the color is, you're always going to see your events pretty clearly. So that's why as a first pass, I usually go to like black, white 200. And of course, the gain you apply is important because sometimes if you're just looking for more structural features, the gain, you turn it up or down. Now in Kingdom, you just use the F5 and F6 keys, and that's a very powerful feature. So when I'm doing structural work, I crank up the gain. Notice, by the way, how the amplitude values are changing. And if I'm looking for real bright spots, then I'm going to lower F6. I'm going to lower the gain so that I can see the more subtle features. So things such as this. So does anybody have any questions about some of these very basic things? So, and I often say that, interpretation, it's mostly about the basics. Yes, we can write fancy Python code. We can use software that will do 60-dimensional cross plots, but a lot of this is understanding the basics and how to look at the data and how to work through it. Okay, so I think, you know, the next thing I was going to mention, so whenever I come to an area, you know, I want to pick a framework of regional events if I can. And I started doing that last week. And of course, this shallow section here, which by the way, it's sort of north and east of Matagorda Island. In the shallow section, you notice the geology is very flat. And let's see, this event is called, let's see which one, 00, yeah. So let's look at that in time. So whenever you have some good events, you should go ahead and track those around. And in this case, we talked last week about ideally you want to go picking every, say, 20 inlines. But in this case, I'm going to be a bit lazy. I've just picked a few and I'm going to use my tracker to infill that. And I can do that only because the geology is very flat in here. So we'll let this one finish here real quick. So most of you have far more complex areas, so you won't be able to do what I just did here, which is to pick 3 events or 3 lines and then have it track across the whole thing. In most cases, you're going to have faults breaking things up. You're going to have throw across those faults. You won't even know exactly how far down you should be going with your next pick until you've tied the wells. Anyway, when you can, when you've got some events that you can track, you should go ahead and do as many of them as reasonably possible. And this should finish in just a moment. Because remember, these layers are your entire tectonic history in the area. And so remember, we just talked about the stratigraphy in the papers, but your seismic is the real stratigraphy. And that's why you ultimately have to come back and tie what you read in the papers to your real stratigraphy. Okay, there we go. So this is our time structure in here. So we can see our highs up to the left in here, our lows to the right. Again, there's a whole art to picking the color palettes for maps. Let's have a quick look in here. So we picked on the Stratton survey, and this is the amplitude of the data. So remember, we picked on a peak in this one here. So the yellow you can see is on a black, which is a peak. Always check it. Black is a positive number, so I'm definitely on a peak. And then if I look at the amplitude map in here, again, we saw last week, I usually like to start my amplitude maps at 0 if I can, if it still preserves character, yeah. Then I've got some scale. So there's the amplitude map. One thing I can see here, just as a straight observation, I'm not too far from the top of the survey. And again, I think we saw some of this last week. Notice I see some striping in here. So this is not to do with geology. This is to do with acquisition footprint in here. So this is to do with the way they shot these lines and the strength of the signals and the ground conditions. So again, some of the bright spot enthusiasts might say, oh, look at all this red stuff here. It's a bright spot. Well, there's a lot of factors in here, including noise. So you got to watch out for that. Okay. So let's zoom back out here. So you can see anyway, I've kind of picked a few events in here, and with time, I'm not going to do that on the fly, but later on you would come in here, you would pick all the faults in here. Now you would come to the hard work of actually trying to correlate across these features, and maybe we'll do that another time. But the reason I bring this up is that one of the next key things, once you have done these, and I would probably put another one here at about 0.6 seconds, one at 0.7, you know, there might be a few others. The next thing I like to do is to come in and flatten, because if I take these horizons and flatten them, I'm now building my own tectonic reconstruction of the area. So here we're going to flatten on the shallowest horizon we have, which is horizon 00. I'm going to allow for an offset of 5 seconds of data above and below. You can cut that lower if you want. Flatten. So this right now we have flattened. So in theory, what you do when you flatten is you're reconstructing things at the time of deposition of the yellow. And with some of my team, we were talking about this yesterday. So I'm going to shrink the vertical scale slightly because I want to see more. So right now we're 8 inches per second. What happens if we go to 6? Yeah, I think that's good. So this is when we flatten in principle, and assuming there's no time distortions, of course, this is what the geology looked like at the time of deposition of the yellow. So what I'll sometimes do is I will come in and say, let's just pretend this is middle Pliocene. Well, this is what the structure looked like at the time of the middle Pliocene. And then I'll come in and I'll do one by one and I'll flatten this for each one. And so I'll then come in, horizon, flatten, we'll go to the green one. And I see I didn't pick all the way, so it's going to not look great over there, but whatever. Yeah, it just drops it. Close. Here is what the paleostructure, which is the correct term, this is what the paleostructure looked like at the time of green deposition. So you can imagine taking a series of JPEG images where basically we're unraveling the geology of the area over time. So let's come back here. I think you get the gist here. So let's go to like the blue, AB03. Okay, so now this is the paleostructure at this time. And so I can come in here. Oh, I've got to close this window. And so whatever the age was at this time, that's what the paleostructure looked like at that time. And so I call this sequential flattening. So now let's just finish off with this one that was actually right above the main zone of tectonic deformation. There you go. So right after this growth fault moved, that's what the structure was. And you can see that if I unflatten, so that's the paleostructure. Let's look at what today's structure is. And that's today's structure. Let's go back again, Yeah, it kind of jumps. Let me see here. But anyway, so this idea of sequential flattening is really important. The other key thing is that a huge part of the history of your area is in the isochron, or actually it's in the Isopachs, but we can use isochron as a proxy in here. So these thickness changes between these layers, every single one is telling you how this area evolved, where the faults were moving, what was high, what was low, etc. So very commonly, what I will then do, having done my sequential flattening picture, which is just a series of JPEGs you can stick into a PowerPoint and then flip through them. The next thing I want to do is I want to know the isochron in this case, or like we have a team that's working in depth, they'll be able to do an isopach. So let's go here to tools, calculators. So math on 2 maps. So the first thing I want to look at is I want to understand the isochron between the blue and the purple. So we're going to take the time of the purple, we're going to take the time of the blue, and we're just going to use a subtraction. So this is now isochron. Yep. Isochron. A, B underscore 03, A, B 05. And then there's a few things, the output map in this case, because these are both in time, and the calculation, it's time, hence it's an isochron. Compute. And that's the isochron. So we are now starting to understand here. So what we can see here is that we are thin, 0.245, and again, this is the thickness from the blue to the purple. So we can see that we were in the orange end here, it's actually fairly uniform over much of the area. That was the structural high, and you had fewer sediments being deposited there. But then what I see here is that there's either like, there could be an issue in the picking or something. We'll have to check that. Aha, yep, sure enough. Okay, so what I'm seeing here, and now let me flatten on the blue because I'm trying to understand the tectonic deposition from the blue to the purple. So let's flatten. Let's go see what it was like at the time of blue, by the time the blue had finished depositing here. Yeah. So that's the paleostructure. As we said earlier, we're flattened on the blue. So if we ignore everything above the blue, this is what the structure was looking like. It makes me close this window before I can move. So that is what our structure looked like at the end of deposition of blue time in here. But what I was looking at is this isopach. So the changes in thickness tell you all about the history in that time. So I don't need to read Galloway to see what was going on in here. This isopach tells me a lot more than Galloway. So I see a thick in here, and what I do see is that actually it does look like there was probably a little fault in here and there was some extra subsidence. And that is what the isopach map is showing us here. So this is basically how you use the isopach map and the sequential flattening to unravel the history. So what I can...
Just to make a comment here, Alan, yeah, this is sort of a process that you can see by Alan looking at that isochron. It tells you something, and when you see those variations, you go back to the seismic and look at the seismic and try to understand what is causing that. Why I'm seeing a thinning or thickening, and whether it's related to something structural or stratigraphic. So this is sort of the unraveling, as Alan said, of the data by looking at the maps and then the vertical seismic sections.
So yeah, so when we tell the teams, you know, when we tell you guys, ideally, and like I say, your data is far more complex than at least these shallow layers I'm showing here. But when we tell you we'd like you to have at least 3 regional markers over your whole area, it is precisely so you can start to unravel these things. So from that isopach, what I'm going to say is, okay, so I now have additional evidence of, I think there's a little fault here because we can see in the tracker, or there could be anyway, there's certainly some evidence of some things thickening in here. So again, I'm not going to do this for every single one. But, you know, Leo, we were talking with you yesterday about the Williston Basin. So this is what you do, basically. In an ideal world, you got the 3D, you make all these individual ones, then you make the isopachs for each one, or isochrons. And now you can start to see how this thing moves, and you're going to see things jump around. You know, you'll get subsidence in one corner, then something else will happen. I mean, this here looks like an indication of some kind of faulting in here, this pattern, unless there's a mispicking, and I'll check on the amplitude here. Oh no, that's the isochron here. I'll have to go back to the other one. But anyway, so actually let's just take a line. So digitize arbitrary line. So this is actually, wherever you see these things jump, it's either, well, it could be a picking problem or it could be a fault. So I don't know. Let's go find out.
Yeah, so when you normally see a linear problem, it's usually a fault. But when you see an irregular edge, like you sort of see a little bit below your line where it sort of curves in and out, that usually indicates that there's something like a picking problem or a variation in the seismic that causes a little bit of a picking problem.
Yeah, so that can certainly happen. Now, you know, again, we're just, like we say, this is what we do in Evolve. We make it up as we go along. But now, and so it's all about observation. So as I look at this now, though, you see the pattern, like the orange, which is a thickening. And now I'm actually seeing that thickening is actually corresponding to some faults that go deeper. And this is probably not perfectly image seismic, by the way. You know, it's not a perfect 3D migration, but now what I'm seeing is that isochron, or yeah, isochron thick in here looks like, at least on this one vertical display, is fault bounded. So this could actually be a little bit of a growth fault here that has thicker sediments on it. And whereas just looking at it this level, I could have thought, well, maybe that's acquisition, footprint, or some striping. But again, because I'm looking, I'm thinking, it looks to me like this is real. And so maybe the next pattern. So we may have a series of faults. And actually, I want to go back now to the amplitude map for purple. I can find it on my messy screen with only one. Let's see, that was the shallow one, 0, 0, window. Maybe I closed that one actually, horizon C38, and we're looking for, so I'm going to pull that up. Yeah, let's just go to horizon 05. Start with time. Okay, so that's the structure map in time, and I want to look at the amplitude just to see if there's anything that might relate to those faults in here. So we see a time structure high in here too. Let's go to amplitude. Okay. And by the way, you know, I'm not using amplitude at this stage to look for bright spots, just in case that's what someone's thinking. In these early stages, I actually use it more often to look for things like faults. So you can see where the amplitude is decreasing here. First pass without looking at it yet, that looks like that's probably a fault. This may be a fault. In fact, you can see we picked a fault in here. So I like to use these early amplitudes more to make sure I'm identifying faults correctly. So anyway, so I think I'm not going to go, as I say, through the entire exercise, but ideally, if you can track regional events, you want to flatten on those sequentially, starting from the first, take a picture, second, third, etc. You want to make the isochrons of each. You want to actually look at the what's called instantaneous amplitude at the event. So it's just showing you what the signal is at that event. And then later on, what you do is you can come in and analyze between those intervals, and we can save that for another time. But again, just since, you know, we're going to be asking you to try to make regional structure maps early on that cover your entire 3D. And so at least now you understand the reason why we're asking you to do that. A couple of other quick things here. You know, when I start early on to look at something, I sometimes like to look at a low frequency version of the data, especially when I'm doing it. I actually will sometimes here actually apply filters. You can apply filters right here in Kingdom. So you can apply a frequency filter. And I'll sometimes cut it way on the high end. Let's just see what that does. Why is it not applying 0, 10? Let me see it here. Huh. Frequency, apply filter, apply to all panels. Ah, there we go. Apply to all panels. That's what I needed to do. And this, because remember, the other thing I'm going to share, and maybe Miss Jenny, tell me if you agree, but you know, on a typical seismic line, there are 1,000 things vying for your attention. You never quite know what to look for. So at least if you start with like a filtered version of the data, you know you're not going to miss the big picture, right? You're going to see the big event. So I can see now filtering back, hey, this is significant, this event here. And here are some events that are bright. We're just going to call them high amplitude. And then now, of course, as I'm an interpreter, always likes to go underneath. Here's some big deep events. So what are those? Hey, is that mantle upwelling? Is that the Cretaceous? I want to know, because my geologist just told me all about the early history. I want to understand where that is. What is the age of that? So again, when you go to these low frequency filters, that's sometimes a good way to not get bogged down in the details you can see. And again, even on this, you can see probably you want to pick another event up in here, etc. So that's one way of doing it. Now, most workstations also have attributes. And let's come back. I'm going to turn that bandpass filter trying to apply to all panels. I'm trying to remove it now. Let's see, time. Okay, I see. It's defaulted back to the other one, so I have to reapply the original one. Okay, there we go. So there's the original filter. And most workstations will have a wide variety of attributes you can run. That's usually a standalone process. In this particular case, in Kingdom, I can run some attributes very quickly. Now, again, we said the art of the color palette. So I ran envelope, which is another low frequency attribute. Envelope has no negative values. So to look at it correctly, you've got to set one of your values to 0. And so again, this is sometimes just a good way to look at the big picture. So right here, I'm immediately seeing, well, in the envelope, something very significant is going on right there. And I'm not going to do it now, but what I would probably do is go ahead and track that event. So I do encourage you, by the way, don't sit and wonder, create a new event, pick. It'll take you 5 minutes to pick a new event, look at it on the map, and move on to the next one. So anyway, just so you know, it's very common to use things like envelope, or I think Miss Jenny likes discontinuity, or Petrel has all these fault attributes. So every workstation has all these. I just picked one. Another important attribute. Oh, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, the discontinuity attributes really help when they're trying to interpret faults, especially looking at time or depth slices.
Yeah, and in fact, since you mentioned that, what I now see on my, if I lower the gain here, you can see where I kind of picked that fault. But now looking at this attribute, I see actually I want to move that fault more like down in here. And it's a bit hard not being at my usual workstation setup, but here, now I can see that fault's doing this. So yeah, those discontinuity and other attributes will often make it easier to see those faults. In fact, now I feel a lot more confident about putting a fault, say, in here. And then, another one that I sometimes look at, it's at times really more for information, but let's just go to frequency, because seismic data has frequency variations, that are very significant. So we've got a frequency attribute. Now, whenever you see something like this, almost always either the data's not been loaded or you don't have your color palette right. So most color palettes, you can do a default where it reads the end members, and it shows you the values. Now, the frequency is one that the black and white palette is not particularly useful for, I think. So usually for this one, I'll go color palette. I like the one, and of course, each workstation has slightly different names for their color palettes. But I believe this one is called RSA, Color Amplitude. I'll use this one. And then it's really critical, again, as a geophysicist, one of the things you really have to know is play with the end member values of the numbers. So the default is 0 to 39 hertz. Now, first thing is I want to flip this because I want the high frequencies, in my case, to be in red. And of course, I'm not going to save it. Let me play a little bit with that palette. What I want to do is see what's significant. So this is the other thing. I think Ms. Jenny will probably agree that, the answer doesn't just get given to you on a plate. You've got to dig around until you find the best way to let anomalous features or features of interest show up. And a lot of that is about working with the palette. So actually, let's go the other direction here.
Yeah, the color palette is important, and everybody sees color differently. And yeah, getting those end members, and sometimes if you display a histogram of the data, depending on the software, whether it'll show that, it gives you some ideas of how to adjust the color palette so that you get the full range of the data that you can see in a histogram.
Yeah, so in this case, we can tell the data goes from as low as 10 and a bit below to about 60 hertz. And not surprisingly, I think you've all heard about things like absorption and Q. Well, your high frequencies get absorbed as your wave travels. And in part, that's what that shows. So no big surprise. Now, if I were working in this shallow zone, I would probably come in and tweak the palette specifically in there. But, this is showing you changes in frequency, which can be due to bed thickness changes very commonly. It can be due to lithology change. It can be due to many things. It can be due to tuning, which is actually a fake effect. But anyway, but this is quite important. Now, one reason that people are very interested in frequency is that our bright spot aficionados, and that's when a bright spot is really due to hydrocarbons, what the literature will tell you is that the bright spots will sometimes absorb the high frequencies. And I'm not saying this is a bright spot, by the way. I'd have to do a lot more work. But if you had a real bright spot here up above here, what you might see, as you can see, you're running at relatively higher frequencies, and all of a sudden, right here, your frequency is dropped. So that's some way. Sometimes if I find an amplitude, this will be yet another check. Is there a low frequency anomaly underneath that amplitude? That would be at least one more piece of evidence. So anyway, so this is just another tool I sometimes use. And of course, you can scroll through and observe different things. I've used frequency sometimes to correlate across faults. Remember, these growth faults can be very difficult to correlate across. If I don't, of course, the best is the biostratigraphy, but if I don't have biostrat, I might use the frequency as just another test on how to correlate across